very fortunate to have with us today, Pastor Josh, who's going to provide us.
Thank you, Dottie.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning, Zoomers. Some Zoom folks on there. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about Gen Z, which is the generation born between 1999 and 2015. And I want to do that for several reasons, but one of which is that I spent a lot of time with them. And, some sociologists and philosophers will say, if you want to know what the greatest issues facing a nation's future are, you need to go with the youngest generation and see what the issues they're facing are. And that's what's really going on underneath in the culture. And so getting into their world is a way of getting into our own. But here, I want to start by saying, by asking questions. So how would you all describe this generation?
Impatient.
What's that? Impatient. Okay. What else? Confused. Okay. Mobile. Yeah.
Can't read the smartphones, texting a lot.
Tech. Yes. That's a big one. Yeah. What else? Those are some good ones. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just throw out a lot of facts, and I read through. There's a research group called Barna Research Group, and Barna they do great research on religion more broadly, and they came out with a study on Gen Z, and their focus was talk about the issues facing Gen Z, their participation or lack thereof in religion, to just sort of give a snapshot. And one of the things that I would observe is true is all of the different generations stereotype one another to some extent, right? Like I'm a millennial. If I asked you, what do you think of millennials? I mean, you might say lazy or entitled or whatever. I've heard it all. And if you were to ask me what I thought of, the greatest generation or boomer, I mean, we all have stereotypes. And sometimes there are parts of those stereotypes that are true, but there's always much more that meets the eye, because as generations, we are all formed by the historical and social tectonic plates that move underneath us as we move through the world. So I want to dig down a little deeper underneath. So screenagers is what some have called them. I generation, screenagers, Zoomers. Gen Z have what is called nomophobia. It is the anxiety of being away from their phone. And it is literally a feeling of that symptomatic of anxiety that is felt when they're not in the presence of the thing, almost like when I leave Joanna at daycare and she cries, which makes me both sad and happy. But it's like she's formed an attachment with me that is chemical, and as I leave, she cries, and it's almost as if Gen Z experiences that with their phone, and others do to some extent, because Lord knows that Gen Z doesn't have the market cornered on being addicted to technology. Gen Z is physically safer, but psychologically more vulnerable than any generation before. They are less likely to get their license when they turn 16. They're less likely to have sex, to drink, to go on dates. Teen pregnancies are rarer than they've ever been in our country, but suicide, depression, and anxiety are more common than they've ever been for people of that age. For Gen Z, the virtual space has become their communal space, and a lot of the reasons for all those things is that community is something that's happening for them online. In 2011, the suicide rate for Gen Z became higher than the teen homicide rate for the first time in 24 years. So in terms of morbidity rates, if you're in Gen Z, you are more likely to take your life than to have your life taken by someone else. So for the first time, a generation claims that statistic. 1/2 of them use their phone 4 hours a day. 1/8 use it 8 hours a day. When asked whether they sleep more than any other generation, Gen Z says that they don't. They have trouble sleeping. This is true, by the way, of all generations right now. People sleep less than they used to. But they claim that they don't sleep. They claim they're tired. And this is true when I ask my youth how they're doing. The words they would give you are stressed, overwhelmed, tired. Those are like the 3 words that they always use. Gen Z is obsessed and clings to achieving happiness, which is not all bad. This is sort of their highest virtue. They've grown up believing that 43% of them said that happiness is defined by financial success. That might not be that different than other generations, but the question is about how they perceived achieving happiness and what the good life looks like. And perhaps one of the biggest struggles that they have is the difference between their appearance online and the self they feel themselves to be truly, and the gap that occurs between those 2 realities. Who I am online and who I really am is producing some really big issues. One, it's okay if I erase this?
Yeah, sure.
One scholar, if you are coming to worship today or have just come from worship, I'm going to use this term. It's a big blanket term that a guy named Charles Taylor has coined. But it's the age of authenticity. And Charles Taylor says that we in the modern era are in the age of authenticity. And that means that the quest of all human beings is to become our most authentic and true selves. And the high priest of the age of authenticity is the individual. And I said this in my sermon. I think I've said this to you last time I talked about Charles Taylor, think of the selfie. So if in the 50s and 60s, the image of soldiers banding together or a community banding together was the image of society, and the idea behind it was we're all in this together, the image of today is the selfie, right? Steve Jobs was really clever when he claimed a device that we all have in our pocket, the iPhone, right? It's not the Wii phone. But it's saying something. This is the device that you use in order to secure your truest, most authentic self. And you can see this all over the place, right? I don't have to even go through examples. It's true in movies, and it's not just true of Gen Z, by the way. The argument is that this age of authenticity is a worldview, and it's at the level of like the air we breathe. It's like oxygen. You don't even know that you are breathing in the age of authenticity that when you truly are. And and culture is moving toward individual desire and what the individual wants. And therefore, when it comes to the moral life, the individual gets to decide. And this is where you get the erosion or the atrophying of belief and trust in institutions, right? So it's commonplace, and probably more commonplace with Gen Z and millennials than it was for y'all's generations, to have a deep distrust of big picture institutions, whether that's financial institutions, whether that's political institutions, whether that's news organizations, right? More than ever today. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember people talking about politics, but I don't remember feeling the sense that people were tired of it. And I don't remember people just saying, no matter if they're right or left or middle or whatever, that they don't believe that the news is a viable source in order to understand and ascertain truth. So if those institutions disappear and atrophy, which used to be the way that we understood what morality was, then what is left to decide for us? And the answer is the individual. You just got to figure it out on your own. And this is true not just of those finance and political institutions, but it's true of religious institutions. A survey was done in the 1960s asking young people which vocations were most trustworthy. Pastors were in the top 10. Today, the same survey was done, and pastors are in the bottom 100. So pastors probably haven't changed too much. We've not gotten more tricksy than we used to be. We're just pastors, but the perception of big picture religious institutions has changed, and people have started to be incredulous towards those things. And that is in part because the age of authenticity has dawned and burned brighter than ever before. And it's also because some of these institutions have earned that distrust the easy way, which is that they earned it, right? They earned it by by losing people's trust. So the age of authenticity, probably more than anything, is determinative of all of these things I'm talking about that produces the generation of Gen Z. The individual is at the highest good. And you all can imagine what happens, right? If the individual is of the highest good and individuals decide what is true and good and right, rather than being a part of an institution like a church or a functioning community that helps you determine the good, how do you know that the way that you are walking is the right way? And what ends up happening is people feel lost. People feel hapless. People feel lost. People feel alone. People feel like the world is against them. And this is how Gen Z feels. And it may look like they're busy and happy on social media, but behind that veneer is a loneliness and an unsureness in the world. What is Gen Z's interaction with Christianity? Well, a post-Christian worldview might be a way to say it. So the percentage of biblical worldview Christians decreases every single generation. And church attendance, by the way, is decreasing in every single generation. So it's not just that younger generations like millennials and Gen Z are going to church less than everyone else. Every generation is less religious than they used to be. And a part of that is that this affects everybody, not just the younger generations. What's distinctive, though, about Gen Z is the percentage of claimed atheists, which is double that of other generations. So while the percentage of church going is sort of on trend with others, Gen Z, there are twice as many atheists in Gen Z than there are of any other generation. Another thing, in Gen Z, there is a sense of chaos and unsafety. And to explain this, I'll talk about two different book and movie series. Not all millennials, but a lot of millennials. One of the big stories that they cling to is the Harry Potter world, right? It was in my generation that Universal Studios brought Harry Potter up, and when Halloween comes around the corner, you're going to see a lot of kids of millennials dressed up as Harry Potter characters. If you're unfamiliar with the story, it's basically a story about good and evil, but ultimately at the end, good prevails. Maybe another story like that is like the Lord of the Rings, which is another story that I really deeply appreciate, which is a story about the battle between good and evil, and in the end, good prevails. But Gen Z clings a little bit more to something more dystopian. And the Hunger Games and Divergent are more their stories. And in those books and movies, the world is almost sort of beyond salvation. Everything is up for grabs. And it's sort of a good versus evil story, but in the end, it's almost as if good can't quite prevail. Evil just keeps popping itself back up again. And this is one of the ways in which Gen Z perceives the world to be dystopian. There's not a just sense of smooth right and wrong, that everything is up for grabs. There's disunity and disharmony. They don't remember a world outside of war, threat to disunity and disharmony. If you think about the dates in which they were born, think about that with me for a moment. So 1999, which I just heard the other day that Gen Z referred to the late 90s as the late 20th century, which made me feel quite old, but 1999 to 2015. So 9/11, right? Iraq War, Afghanistan War. What other big events took place in the 2000s?
Recession.
What?
Recession.
2008. The advent of the iPhone.
Cryptocurrency.
Crypto. Yeah, so instability in markets, right? And I mean, live golf. I love golf. Is another great example of this sort of the old and traditioned way gets interrupted by a new way. I'm not here to debate the goods or the evils of live golf, but it's sort of yet another example. It's like the crypto of the sports world, where this new, different kind of thing just pops up out of nowhere and questions the old and determined way that we've always done things, right? And that's taking place in a sport that we all thought was sort of untouchable, right? Golf. Yeah, okay. Crypto, the advent of social media. What's interesting about millennials is millennials remember the world pre-tech, pre-iPhone, and they remember the world after it. We're the bridge. So I started texting my freshman year of college, and I got my first iPhone right before Laura and I were getting married and before we went to grad school, okay? Gen Z doesn't remember a time without the iPhone. It's just assumed for them. And in 2013, we found ourselves into one of our first major teen mental health crises that we've ever seen in our country because of the rates of increase in anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation. And studies have just quite literally linked those factors to the advent of Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and TikTok. There's just a direct correlation. There's no sort of fuzzy, well, social media is not great. I mean, and this isn't to say I'm not a troglodyte. I don't think that all tech is bad, but I think of technology like Paul talks about, the principalities and powers. Like, we didn't realize what we had in our hands, and it was much stronger than we realized, and it morphed on us, and all of a sudden we've gotten ourselves into a terrible situation. Like the creator of the like button, for instance, created the like button in 2014, I think. And it was this big project that Facebook was talking about that was going to unite the world. People, it was going to charge positivity throughout the land, because you could tell somebody that you woke up and walked your dog and they could like it and you could feel good about yourself, right? But they really believed that. They really believed that, right? And in my sermon today, I'm going to talk about the way that our view of what we do is often skewed. We all have a self-serving bias where we look at our actions through a more rosy lens than they actually are. And this is what Facebook thought would happen. What ended up happening is the like button made people feel terrible about themselves. It created what's called FOMO. What's FOMO?
Fear of missing out.
Fear of missing out. Yeah, fear of missing out. FOMO is a well-known reality of millennials and Gen Z. Did any of you all know what FOMO was? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I know all my buttons.
2008, 2000, we're going to keep going through dates here. 2016. So polarizing election. So, I mean, these kids understand that the world is divided into tribes in a way that is incomprehensible to the upbringing that I had. I knew about politics. I knew who my parents voted for. I sort of maybe knew the reasons. I could have possibly articulated for you what my political views or aspirations were. But that was about it. But ingrained into them is this sense that things are not cohesive. The sort of anger and vitriol that's built into, and 2016 is just I don't care if you voted for, that's just a representative of what's kind of been going on for the last 10, 15 years. What else has happened since 2016?
I guess you could, but maybe it's a part of 2016, the idea of fake news media.
Yeah.
It's gone from,
So
that's different. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I would say that's a part of the whole deal, right? That's a part of news as an institution, like Walter Cronkite, right? Like people across different political aspirations used to watch the news and expect that the news was going to tell you what was happening and was going to interpret the history and things going on in a way that made sense to human life, right? Well, those days are completely dead now, right? There's 1,000 news agencies, and depends on who you are and the way the algorithms are written, they literally they entrench our beliefs even further.
There's an critical thinking.
Yeah.
They have an narrative.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a big thing toward news commentary instead of news facts.
Sure.
And I can't appreciate that. I have a friend that wants to watch news commentary.
understand and
Yeah.
know what's really going on.
And what's hard is that these very institutions that also are doing commentary, it's not as if everything they say is false, but because we assume it is, we throw out anything that would have helped us. And now we're sort of left being like, well, who are you going to listen to, right? Which fact is a good fact? Not to mention that, our brains were neurologically wired in order to comprehend the amount of suffering of a village full of people. Okay, so we could comprehend the pain and suffering of about 50 people at a time. We can handle that much. Well, the iPhone has made it such that we are aware of the suffering of billions of people across the world at the tap of a finger, which leaves us almost feeling like we're short-circuiting. It's like if you view our time as humans as we have a pail of water of love and compassion to spread, it's like we're spread thin.
Compassion fatigue.
Yeah. Yes. Compassion fatigue. The last big, and this study, by the way, that I read was pre this event. We all know about it, right? 2020. Pandemic. So look at these dates, right? 9/11, 2 wars, 2008, 2013, 2016, 2020. War in Russia, 2022, another supposed recession, 2022. These are the events that are putting pressure on the world of Gen Z. And so they feel as if the world is completely uncertain and a scary place. And they're right in some ways they're not. Okay. In 1971, 80% of third graders walked to school. That is now 9%. And sure, there's reasons of transportation, et cetera, for that, but there's a perception that the world is more dangerous than it may be. And a part of the reason for that is in the 1970s, you guys didn't hear about what was going on, what violence erupted in Iran, right? And now we do. Another part of their worldview is extreme scientism, by which I mean that the only things that are true in this world are what you can see and experience with your senses. You can see, taste, touch, feel, hear. And anything outside of that scientific fact is questioned, right? Well, this poses a huge issue for Christianity, right? Because the gospel writers, when they describe the resurrection of Jesus, they don't actually describe the moment itself, right? It's something to be believed by faith. So where does the leap of faith fit in with a generation that almost needs the exaction of science because they need to feel like something is in control, right? If everything else is out of control, it makes sense to me that people's belief would be, well, what I can taste and smell and prove is what's going to be true, because I just don't have room for anything else. They are also the most diverse generation. And this keeps occurring, but what that means is by dint of the fact that they go to school with just people with different worldviews who grew up in homes of different religions or grew up in different countries, that there's an exchange and a converging of just different cultures and ideas that are up for debate in a way where their navigation of the world just in high school is much more complex than mine was and than y'all's was. And not all of that is necessarily a negative thing. I mean, I've found in Gen Z an understanding and an openness to the world that I probably did not have when I was 18 years old. And there's some really good things from that. When I take kids to Mexico and see the way they interact with the Mexican culture, the people that we serve, they are extremely good and adept at finding themselves in a new culture, in a new place, and understanding that these people speak a different language and they have some different assumptions about the world, but I can still interact with them, and I'm amazed by that part of them.
But gender identity.
Yeah. Yes, and that's another huge part of their generation more than any of ours, right? That's another thing that's completely up for grabs, and you can see how things like gender identity are a product of the age of authenticity, because if life is about who you most feel yourself to be, then that's going to all come into play. And so, yeah, kids have to deal. I mean, kids have to deal with that at a level at a young age that I couldn't even imagine, where this is just up for debate around them. And they have friends who are claiming different identities and they're trying to figure out which way is up. Yes.
I think something that probably should be added to the list over there is mass shootings and murders becoming so commonplace throughout the country.
Yeah, I just heard the other day, I'm sure y'all heard about the fake shooting that was going to happen at a football game, and several of my students were there. But it doesn't matter if the shooting didn't happen. They experienced it as if it did. They were hiding under tables in the cafeteria. And I just heard the other day, some of my students were saying, I'm not going to school today because somebody left a note at the drinking fountain that said, I'm going to come shoot up the school tomorrow at Salisbury High. And a lot of my students do great at Salisbury High. I think it's a great place. But navigating active shooter drills, going to a public place and knowing where your exits are. Yeah, it's a different thing altogether. They have a love-hate relationship with the church. 3 out of 10 Gen Zers say, non-Christian teens say that the problem of evil, so why do bad things happen to good people, and science versus faith are their biggest barriers to being interested in Christianity. Which is, I had this conversation with an atheist youth a week ago who wants to be an astrophysicist and is extraordinarily bright. And we talked about science and faith, and I said, for 17 centuries since the advent of Christianity, science and faith have not been pitted against one another. Galileo, Newton, all of them were Christians, and they were practicing their mathematics and science inside of the church. These were extensions of the church. And I told her, I've always understood science and faith as being 2 different languages of trying to reach at the same mysterious thing that one cannot contain, which is the God who created the universe. And the problem with scientism is it tries to answer questions that only Christianity can, which is, why am I here as a human being? What is a soul, right? I don't care how smart you are. Richard Dawkins or Albert Einstein can't answer to me scientifically why I am a human being. Where did I come from? What does it mean to have a human soul? But they don't always have to be a conflict. And one of the things that we have to do, by the way, is engage these issues head on, because if we don't, they're just going to want nothing to do with us. They're just going to want nothing to do with us. 1/4 of Gen Z believe that the Bible and science can be complementary. So some believe that there's still a vestige of that. 45% of boomers believed that, by the way. Young men in Gen Z are less religious and less academic than men have been in any generation. So they're going to college less and they're going to church less than young men in any generation have before. So it is fair to say that there is sort of a masculinity problem in this generation in terms of religiosity and in terms of academic. Women are more religious and are going to school and college more. 2 out of 5 parents have talked to their children about social media and its usage in this generation. So this isn't to cast aspersions on parents, because I'm a parent and finding it to be pretty challenging. And I can't imagine as Joanna grows up how much more challenging that is. We all, any of you who have been parents know that it's the best and hardest thing you've ever done. But what's unique about the relationship between Gen Xers, that's the relationship above me as a millennial, and Gen Zers, is that they're the only generation where the parents grew up with no access to social media or technology whatsoever, and that their kids, that's the only world they know. So the gap between those 2 generations in terms of how they see and perceive the world is enormous. Now, I know that when I was growing up, the perceived gap between what I saw and what my parents saw, it's always that way. But just in terms of understanding what's going on, this statistic, only 40% of parents talk to their kids about social media, shows that there's a disconnect happening. Because social media and technology, probably I would argue, is the chief issue of where the challenge is most with this generation. What time do I got, by the way?
Much time as you want.
But what?
Right now, it's around 2. It's almost 10.
Okay, I'll go for like 7 more minutes and then we'll call it. So relevant worldview topics as Christianity relates to young people. They want to know about the historical evidence of Jesus. So if you have a scientist worldview and you believe in the things that you taste, touch, smell, see, then you want to know about the historical facts. And the good news is, we don't talk about this a lot in church, but there are great historical ways to talk about the life of Jesus. For example, the crucifixion accounts in the 4 Gospels are the best historical sources of Roman crucifixion that exist in history. And this is because the Romans crucified people all the time. They inherited crucifixion from another ancient Near Eastern culture, from the Babylonians and the Assyrians before them, but they perfected it. But they didn't like to talk about it. It's like they knew, because they were a historian, they knew that what they were doing and how brutal it was, but they didn't want to be remembered by it. And so the 4 Gospels give us an extremely historical and interesting account into what a crucifixion at the hands of the Romans would have actually meant. And by the way, it is scientifically and historically, I'll just say plain wrong or bad history and bad science to say that the person of Jesus did not exist, which some people would say. Irrefutable historical evidence that he did exist, and not just because of the 4 Gospels, but because rival traditions, such as the rabbinic traditions and Roman historians, wrote about him, not to mention the Quran, right? So if you get the other 2 major world religions writing about the existence of the figure, it's pretty good, substantial evidence, not to mention the extent evidence in the 4 Gospels and archaeology that he existed. They want to know about the origins of the Bible. Where did this thing come together? How did it come together? How did it become Holy Scripture? The canonization of the Bible was a 4-century long, complicated process, yes, by which the Holy Spirit was working through human beings in order to create this divine word that comes from God. But how is it that certain books were left out and others weren't? Or why is it that Catholics have extra books in their canon than Christians do, right? Or why is it that in the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, has extra chapters in the book of Jeremiah than does the English translation that comes from the Hebrew? So if somebody says, I believe that the Bible is to be literally interpreted and lived out, my question to them is, well, I believe the Bible is relevant for today, but which Bible is the Bible you're talking about? Is it the Catholic Bible? Is it the Bible that includes the Septuagint? Is it the Bible that is translated from the Hebrew, which is in 8th century? Do you take into account the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st century? Which Bible? Conversations with interfaith is another big one for this generation. They want to, because of the diversity of their generation, understand the differences between Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Christianity. And sometimes in our world, we tend to do this by smoothing out the things that we actually really believe. One time we just all need to get along. And in order to do that, let's dumb down Christianity. But what I've found in interfaith dialogue is that a Jew actually really wants to know why I believe Jesus is the Messiah. Because the chief difference I have with a Jew is that they don't, right? Mm-hmm. It's that it's incomprehensible to them that the Messiah was the Son of God crucified and raised on the 3rd day. That to them doesn't make sense. There's a divergence there, but we have an entire Old Testament that we can agree on and talk about and interpret. Conversations with people of other beliefs. Okay, I've given you a lot, so I'm just going to end it by talking about what's a church to do. And first answer to that is I don't know if it's difficult, but here's some thoughts. Okay, youth ministry is throwing darts at a moving target. That's what I tell people all the time. First thing is empathy and compassion, right? So just as I can have empathy for the way in which my grandfather grew up around the Great Depression, and the ways in which that shock would have been absorbed into his system and the way that he understood the world and money and all of that, we need to look at these 8 dates, and rather than seeing Gen Z like, oh my gosh, those phone addicted kids. They're just lazy and they're annoying and all they care about is TikTok and they don't care about anyone else, and the world is just screwed because they're going to be, they're going to be the ones running the show later on. Rather than taking that, what if we had empathy and compassion? Because this is the world we gave them, right? This is the world that they've been born into. If you had been born into that world, you would probably be very similar than they are. Empathy and compassion. You're not going to get anywhere with them if you judge them first. They're going to just close the door. The second is going away from a gospel of sin management, where the gospel becomes a list of to-dos, and moving instead toward a gospel that is more holistic, a gospel about the grace and mercy of God, a gospel that Paul described as the law and its commands were put to death and crucified in Christ, because by grace we have been given faith in Jesus, which is to say to our young people, I tell this to them every single time I see them, there is nothing you can do to earn your way into God's good graces. There's no amount of GPAs, there's no amount of followers on Instagram. None of that will get you there. And if you try to chase that kind of perfection, what you're going to be left with is loneliness and despair. This has already been done for you in the person of Jesus Christ. There's only been one person who's ever been perfect, and that's Jesus. And his obedience allows us to respond in love and obedience in the world and for others. Another thing is to show up on their turf, right? So it's easy for us to say that evangelism is opening our church doors, right? Or why are Gen Z in every man's Bible class? We just open up the doors and sing the hymns, and why aren't they here? And we got to meet them. We got to meet them on their turf, right? So go to their football games, go to their soccer games, come to my porch on Wednesday night. We have Bible study, there's Domino's pizza, and all the cheer wine you could ever drink. And I do that because I know for some of them, especially the unchurched ones, that walking in church doors, that they feel much more hesitant than they do coming on my porch. So I'm meeting them on their turf. As one person says, what we need to give them are reasons, relationships, and rhythms. Reasons, a faith that is true and stands up to the evidence and feels relevant to their lives. Relationships, meeting their isolation, like this is true especially after the pandemic, with relationships of love and acceptance and mentoring. Studies show what can happen in a young person's life in relation to their faith with just having one adult other than their parents journey with them. It's astounding. That does much more good than them memorizing the 10 Commandments. It just does. And rhythms, patterns of community where they can practice spirituality and ask the questions that they want to ask. So in short, there is a God. Truth exists. You can't just come up with truth on your own. This is how the world is. This is how we've been made, and this is what Jesus does about it. That's the kind of expression of Christianity that they want to experience. I'll end with this. One writer has said that Gen Z is living in a cultural Babylon. So in the Old Testament, the Israelites are taken away into exile by Babylon, and they're there for 50 years. This exile from home shapes their understanding of faith more than anything else in the Old Testament, and still shapes Jews' identity today. Living in a foreign land, a land where the practices are different, where everything that felt certain is now unstable. So if the faith of our generations of Jerusalem had faith at its center, the faith in Babylon has faith at the margins. If our worldviews were mono religious, where you could just kind of grow up as a Christian and not have to bump up against other ones, their world is pluralistic. It's a world where there are many religions contesting one another. Our world and faith was slower paced, right? You all talk about and rightly bemoan that the days of the just slow paced porch culture feel like they're disappearing. And the world today is accelerated and frenetic. Our world was homogenous. Their world is diverse. Our world was central control. Their world is open source. Our world is a simpler life. Theirs is a tension between bitter and sweet. Our idol is false piety. Their idol is fitting in or not missing out. So if we try to do a Jerusalem ministry for a generation that's caught in Babylon, we're just going to miss them. We're just going to miss them. Any questions or thoughts or reflections about, that's a sprint where a marathon is needed. But I hope when you see our youth, some of this can come to mind for you, and help you have empathy for what's really going on with them. And you know, at the end of the day, we're all human beings.
That FOMO,
Things.
FOMO,
Mhm.
fear of missing out. He said that's where they are, FOMO.
Now, what age group is he talking about?
Kids that are Z, born after 19.
Novel and sort of refreshing. That they, I guess you could have it reaching for your phone, or
Yeah.
whatever, and you can concentrate on the experience and the relationship with each other and people
Yep.
are in Mexico.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I stole their phones, and it was terrible the first 24 hours. But then you know what they say to me now? They say, I absolutely hated you for that. Please do it again. Because I told them, I said, you're gonna, you know, from now until you're buried 6 feet under, you're gonna have this device yapping at you in your pocket, and I'm gonna give you 6 days outside of that. And it's pretty cool to see what happens.
Thank you so much. man.
Wow.
No, thanks.